Welcome to A-Team Group's RegTech Summit Virtual Event 2020. We'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, SmartStream and Bureau van Dijk, our gold sponsors, the Derivatives Service Bureau, ACA Compliance Group, AWS Partner Network, Axiom SL, Capitec, Univista, Automated Intelligence, and Flamin KYC Software, and our event partner, the UK Department for International Trade. Connect with your peers on the networking page, and if you have questions for our speakers, please use the comment function next to the live stream. Thank you for attending and enjoy the session.
Hello everybody, and welcome to day 2 of our RegTech Summit virtual event. My name is Andrew Delaney. I'm President and Chief Content Officer at A-Team Group, and I will be hosting the sessions for today, helped with some able helpers, some moderators who are going to work through various aspects of this session. Today's theme centers around 2 main topics. Those are Brexit and ESG, and for each we'll be looking at how those will impact the regulatory environment, and by extension, how we should be responding as an industry. As always, we're very grateful to be exploring these themes with the help of some serious RegTech experts from across the industry. So a big thank you to all of our speakers. As always, as well, a hearty thanks to our sponsors who were mentioned in the video before, and we'll get mentions, I'm sure, throughout the day. I'd like just to take this moment to remind everybody to visit the networking and sponsor sections of the platform. There are a bunch of prize draws going on, some nice giveaways. I think there's a tablet, some Amazon vouchers, Christmas is coming, etc., etc. So please do take a look at those and try and engage where you can with those sponsors who have been generous enough to support this event. I say this for our live event, and the same is true for this virtual event. It is the sponsors' support that makes this a free event. Wouldn't be possible without their support. I can't stress it enough. So please kick any tires where you can. Make them happy so they want to come back and give us some more, support more events like this so you can enjoy this free content. Okay, so the other aspect to this, part of my job really is to remind you all that we'll be using Slido to ask questions and vote in polls throughout today's session. Slido should be embedded into the platform on the right side of this video screen that you're watching right now. So go into Slido, and from there you can ask questions anonymously if you choose to do so, and you can vote in the polls that we'll be running from time to time during the actual panel sessions. Okay, so with that, I think that's enough from me. I was going to mention one more thing, and that is that you may have noticed that we're using a new platform for this session. We're now on our 3rd or 4th virtual event this year. I think we've probably done more than anyone else in this field. And for this one, we've actually built our own platform. So, so far so good. It's running nicely. We're very happy with the functionality, but we'd love to know what you think. I should also mention that we do have people talking about using this platform for their own events. So if that's something you might be interested in, then please do get in touch. Okay, commercial break over. Let's get going on today's session. So first panel session that we're going to turn to today is one that will talk about how to prepare for Brexit. We'll be talking about what the new regulatory and reporting environment will look like, and how financial institutions should prepare. Not that we've got an awful lot of time to do so. For this session, moderating duties will be handled by Naresh Raja, who is joining us. Yep, there's Naresh. Welcome, Naresh. Naresh is a member of A-Team's RegTech Advisory Board. As you may know, we have a board of experts who help us pull together the various topics that we discuss on these events. He has over 20 years of experience in and around data regulation, automation, innovation, and transformation, most recently as Deputy Chief Data Officer at a Tier 1 universal bank. So he's been involved in a lot of complex regulatory and data programs at board level, including those related to Brexit changes and GDPR. So I think that's Naresh is going to run this next session. Over to you, Naresh.
Thank you, Andrew. Welcome, everybody. And so good morning to everybody in the US and good afternoon to everybody in the UK. We have a fantastic panel that we've lined up for this session. And what I'm going to ask, first of all, is everybody to provide a bit of a brief introduction. So Linda, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Kaufman, and I am Executive Vice President at SmartStream Technologies. I'm responsible for overseeing the SmartStream Reference Data Utility, affectionately called RDU. I joined RDU in the product management area back in 2015 after many years in the reference data space, and I kind of jumped headfirst into the regulatory services arena, and I'm very happy to be here today.
Thank you, Linda. Could I ask David perhaps to go next?
Yes, thank you, Naresh, and greetings, everybody. I'm a former diplomat with bilateral and multilateral exposure to the UN, the OECD, the European Parliament. For the last decade or thereabouts, I've specialized in monitoring, reporting, and commenting on the emerging EU financial services regulatory regime. I interface frequently with people in the European Parliament, the European Commission, and speak on conferences of this nature. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Adrian, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hello all. Adrian Whelan. I'm the Global Head of Regulatory Intelligence for Brown Brothers Harriman, a global custodian. And in a nutshell, I advise our clients, which are asset managers and banks, on global regulation, one of which for the last number of years has included Brexit. So it's great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Adrian. Andrew, would you like to go next?
Ron.
Sorry, Ron.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thanks, Naresh. So my name is Ron Finberg. I'm a product and regulatory specialist at Capitec. And we specialize in providing services and automation services for lots of transaction reporting, EMIR, MiFID, SFTR, and areas that are definitely being affected by Brexit.
Fantastic. Well, I think there's a lot of great expertise and experience on here, which is great to see. We're going to go through a set of questions, and it'd be great to have the panelists give us a view. The first question really is, what will the impact of Brexit be on the UK markets and participants? And so if I could ask David maybe to start with that question, and then Adrian to come in after that.
Yeah, well, clearly we're in a very critical, perhaps last couple of days of negotiations between the EU and the United Kingdom. I think there is an expectation in Brussels and elsewhere that there will be a deal, there will be an FTA, albeit imperfect, between now and perhaps the end of this month. I think the reasons for this are pretty obvious. I don't think anybody was expecting the COVID-19 crisis. Nobody was expecting a second dip into this crisis. And given the massive recessionary sentiments that are going on between governments and the United Kingdom, I think the sense is that we do not need yet another a major crisis on our hands. We need to find a compromise of sorts, which I think we will get to be. That would be my prediction. That's the good news. The bad news is that any FTA reached between the EU typically does not include financial services provisions. That is left up to an instrument called the EU equivalency regime, whereby the EU makes an assessment of the third country's supervisory and regulatory landscape, as it were. And that hasn't happened. Now, the only good news to come about in the last couple of weeks is the recognition that derivatives clearing, which represent about 534 billion euros of clearing per year or thereabouts in the City of London, will indeed benefit from an extension of its temporary equivalency regime for 18 months beyond March 2021. So that's very good news. That ensures that we don't have a sudden rupture in the financial flows between the two major regions. There's also talk, incidentally, Naresh, in the last 48 hours, interestingly, spurred by the French government, concerned about the derivatives trading obligation. Something like at least a notional value of, what is it, 50 trillion euros of derivatives are cleared in Europe, most of them through London per year. And again, the sense is that, you know, these will perhaps migrate not to the rest of Europe in the absence of an equivalency agreement, but to the United States. And this is something that is spooking the EU member states at the moment. They do not expect to see an outcome of this nature. Clearly, there is one big issue out there that needs to be addressed, and that is the investment, systemically important investment firms of a third country nature that are based typically in London. They will face quite a dilemma at the end of the year because we don't have an equivalency arrangement in place, and the Commission has said it has no plans to come forward with a decision. That means, in short, that from the beginning of next year, 2021, that all systemically important investment firms will have to negotiate on a country-by-country basis to obtain some degree of access to national markets, and that can be very complex.
David, that's very, very insightful. Thank you. Adrian, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, and I don't want to be repetitive. I'll diverge a little bit away from what was said, but it's interesting. We are very, very close to the end of the transition period. And David touched on some of the open items that probably have a high probability of not being resolved. If you go down another layer into the technicalities, there's a myriad of topics on asset management, banking, insurance that are left unresolved. Now, the probability of this, if you were back even 2 years ago when the political tensions were even higher, was that, oh, we'll have some sort of deal. And I would agree in a non-technical term, I think we will have some form of deal by year end, the so-called skinny deal. So the so-called skinny deal, for anybody that wants to know what that looks like, it's currently 600 pages of very high level with a load of parentheses to include. So you're talking about 1,000 pages for a skinny deal. And quite correctly, the skinny deal deals with very, very few of the issues that we're here to talk about, which is financial regulation and cross-border. So that's where we're at. There has been progress made, but not enough to give anybody any sense of confidence if you haven't got your shop in order as of now. So that's, I suppose, my opening statement is that even though we're really close to the Brexit deadline, there's a lot of things that literally people are helpless to change. Then you get to the equivalency point, which is absolutely where we're at. And I'll be a little bit more definitive. You know, MiFID services is a huge element of the entire cross-border European market for banks, issuers, and asset managers. The likelihood of having MiFID equivalence by year end is close or near close to zero. The other thing is there's an open review of MiFID, which the Commission have absolutely said we aren't in a position to provide an equivalency determination until mid next year. So sometimes the hope that kills you. And what I would say, and what I've been saying actually for 3 years, not to say that I'm right, but the only advice you can give at this point is plan for the worst, which in financial services terms is there is no deal, and hope for the best. Maybe you'll get something. Now, maybe you'll get something. What can we get? David again touched on an excellent point on clearing. The The EU granted targeted time-bound equivalence on that issue because there's no substitute in the EU. The entities are literally not there to provide the services currently from the UK. There's other elements of exported financial service from the UK that don't have a natural short-term home in the EU. So we could lose them, not just from the EU, but just from Europe, from the UK and the EU. Could go to Hong Kong, it could go to New York, it can go to other financial services. That's where to focus. That's where to focus. Are the EU, through again self-serving, or will they have to not give broad mutual equivalence, which the Chancellor of the Exchequer asked for last week, but will they give increasing amounts of targeted short-term equivalence to aid the smooth transition through the period? And then mid next year, we can all take a breath, sit down, take the skinny deal out, which will be over 1,000 pages, and then get a really detailed future-led set of regulations, which will go into the tens and hundreds of thousands of pages. So it's loads of good news from me here today.
Fantastic, Adrian. So there's a number of lawyers and regulatory specialists who've been in the game for a while yet. So that's
I'm in the right gig.
very, very good. Well, that's good to know. So let's move on from that to the second question is, which aspects of regulations are likely to change with regards to transaction reporting? And where is this divergence expected? So I'm going to ask Ron, not Andrew. Ron, in terms of what your views are. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. So I think the good news, after David and Adrian had mentioned, there's quite a few items that are up in the air and that people don't know. I think transaction reporting, the future of it, at least from day one, is pretty grounded and is it's pretty apparent what's going on. So if you look at EMIR and MIFIR and SFTR, it's pretty much the good news is that there aren't that many changes on day one. The actual items that have to be reported are more or less going to be exactly the same. I think the one change that exists is for SFTR. Come January, non-financial companies in the UK will not be under scope. They don't have to report. While in the EU, they do have to report. So there are some ramifications for firms that are doing delegation for their clients. Other than that, come day one, the one item that, as we prepare for the last, month or two before we go to Brexit, is if you are an EU firm and you're working with a UK repository or arm, you have to make sure now that you have a contract in place to be working with an EU repository and arm, or vice versa. If you're with the UK, you have to be doing that with a UK arm or a trade repository. So that's in the in the initial phases. I think in terms of where things are going to be diverging with transaction reporting in the future, it's probably in the medium term comes up to what's products that are in scope. I think Linda will be covering this a little bit more in depth in the future. But one area to mention, and I think those go back to what David and Adrian mentioned about just you don't necessarily have the clearing and the venues in place for a lot of the front office functions. And what's going to happen is there's going to be different changes in liquidity pools. So certain products that might start off the bat trading in both the UK or being available in both the UK and the EU will suddenly only be in one or the other. So from a regulatory reporting aspect, certain items that may be under scope in the UK and MiFID will no longer be in scope, and those are areas that people have to kind of really dynamically keeping their eyes on what's in scope and what's out of scope. So I think that's where things are going to be divergent in the future. Other than that, and one item that is worth mentioning because we've recently gotten questions about it is in terms of some of the EMIR refit exemptions. There's an intergroup exemptions. I know at least from the FCA side that they're going to allow during the transitional phase for the next year, that if you had an exemption with your EU company, then you could continue to have that EU and UK exemption. They'll look at it as one calculation instead of two different entities.
Great, thank you, Ron. That's really helpful to know. David, very briefly, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, To Ron's list, I would add the double volume cap in the dock pool trading space. The United Kingdom has been very clear that it never liked this particular MiFIR instrument. It was directed typically against the United Kingdom, where most of the dock pool trading takes place, and it imposes, as you know, a suspension on EU trading in any one dock pool, and it reaches 4%, and across all dock pools at 8%. And clearly, many EU finance ministers are still very keen to curb the whole dock pool trading space, whereas the UK would clearly, I think, prefer to take a more liberal approach to it. So that's certainly one area of significant divergence. And by the way, just to go back to to what previous speakers have spoken about, one of the things that's holding up the whole equivalency determination is not just the time, it's also the fact that the perception and within the Commission and elsewhere is that the United Kingdom is going to diverge quite significantly, such as in this area of the dock pools. And the other area, of course, is the question of bilateral hub and spoke versus multilateral trading facilities. The Commission is minded to close some of the loopholes there, perhaps even integrate systemic internalizers into the MMF regime, tighten up on those rules, remove the waivers. So there are a number of areas where I think we are going to see some significant divergences. And clearly the Commission's view is, it's not that we object to divergences per se. There will always be divergences, as we've had with the US. But what's needed is a two-pronged approach going forward. One, the equivalency regime, which is, for what it's worth, unilateral. And secondly, regulatory dialogue, as has been the case for the last, 10, 15 years with the US. And this is what will, I think, help us to get over this particular difficult, trying period where we do need to accelerate in terms of the equivalency determination.
Naresh, just quick, really briefly, if I can put in, again, it's the cognitive dissonance from both sides on equivalence is really interesting. So I'll go back to, there was a key speech last week by Rishi Sunak, where, again, the UK broadly granted equivalence to EU on a raft of things. But in the second stanza of the speech, and one of the key tenets of European regulation at the moment is ESG, the UK said that we do wish to have our own ESG mandate and rules and regulations. But at the same time, so that's commonality of theme, but they also said that they didn't wish to bring in the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations, because they're probably overly onerous. So you're going to get a different version of ESG regulations in the UK, which will be fine and dandy and good, but they are different to the EU. So out of one side of the mouth, and it's not it's equivalence and staying the same, yet even in the same on a critical issue, there's already divergence. And to David's point, that's why it's hard to see mutual equivalence being granted in the now.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Understood.
Yeah.
I'm going to move us on. It's a kind of fantastic conversation, and I think the audience will have great insight from this. So thank you everyone on this question. I think I'm just going to hand this over to the audience actually to participate rather than the five of us talking away. And we have a poll that we'd like you to participate in, and then we'll have a brief conversation. So the poll is open, and the question we'd like to ask all of you is, with less than 3 months to go until the end of the Brexit transition period, what are the outstanding challenges that you all face in your organizations and as leaders in financial services organizations and beyond, and in the fintech ecosystem? What are the challenges that you face in preparing for Brexit? Is it the lack of detail on regulatory change? Is it the shortage of time due to resources, time, etc., being focused on COVID-19? Is it the difficulty in changing to the different reporting mechanisms? We've touched on some of the equivalence differentiations, but some of the reporting conversations which are going on. Is it working out how to access the EU market? Or, I would be rather surprised about this, which is no outstanding challenges at all. So the poll is now open. We really welcome the audience to participate in that poll, and we'll have a brief conversation about that after you've all had a chance to do that. So whilst the poll is going on, I'm going to ask our panel to move on, and in the interest of time, actually answer briefly, please, our next question, which is, what should financial institutions really be doing right now to prepare for Brexit? And has COVID, or how has COVID impacted the preparedness of financial institutions with regard to Brexit? So first, I'm going to ask Adrian to comment, please.
Yeah, so preparation, as I've said, it's clouded in uncertainty, but the time is running out. And as I've said, the uncertainties are going to remain uncertain. So you need to take as much action as you can now. And then without fudging it, it depends. It depends on the nature, scale, and complexity, as always, of your model. So for many people, for many firms, Brexit has already happened, okay? They've decamped perhaps from the UK, which was their main base, to have an EU-based home. There's still entities that we talk to, banks and asset managers, who still are working through that process. The legal mechanics is not so much focus. It's actually structural issues or organizational issues. And one of the biggest impacts, not in the poll, but it's kind of related to the working out access. I think, how do you sell and distribute your products currently? So one red ticket item, I suppose, is a lot of banks and asset managers have historically utilized a London or UK based distributor who have sold the financial products from London cross-border through Europe under MiFID primarily. Without equivalence and without being an EU MiFID firm, some of that is really hamstrung. So if you haven't worked out your supply chain broadly, or specifically your distribution, sales and marketing under MiFID, that's something that in the next 40 whatever days that are left, that you really do need to act upon. And I would get a shorter term focus towards Brexit generally. So we're talking a little bit about in the ether and the longer term and what does it mean. But there's some very specific contractual, organizational, structural and supply chain issues that firms can make definitive decisions on, and surely need to be making them in the next, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 days.
And I'm going to ask Linda to comment on that. But before I do, there's a question from the audience, Linda. If you could incorporate that in your answer, that would be fantastic. Putting you on the spot, but I do like doing that from time to time. Will the post-Brexit regulatory regime disadvantage financial services firms in the UK? And if so, how can they address them?
Okay, I'll kind of combine it in there. But I think that, we've talked a lot so far about some of the dynamics involved in the equivalency, et cetera, and so forth. But I think that there's some really tangible stuff from the back office that needs to happen. And so, everyone was running around last year in a frazzled state, trying to prepare. And a lot of firms that we were dealing with on the data management and technology fronts got just so far. And then the theme was, I don't want to implement everything because I don't want to take that last step without knowing exactly what's happening and incur the cost of throwaway work. And so I think for the first part of your question about, what should they be doing now? There are very technical data management perspectives that Ron's touched on a bit around, being prepared for the termination of all the records. I mean, these are really, really fundamental, basic things, but firms, at least in the last round of discussions, their eyes weren't on that, and now they have to be. So prepared for all of the terminations from the ESMA, FIRDS file for all the UK records. There's going to be a large number of updates as ESMA goes from RCA to NCAs in their feeds. All this data is available now from the FCA for FIRDS and FIDRs, so there should be a really, you should be head first into your UAT if you're with a third-party provider, or if you decided to buy, build instead of buy, you should be in that QA cycle. So it should be already being consumed and, being tested. But I think the long-term game is a solution that can handle, as everybody here is saying, the diverging regulations. So you can't have one set of data. You need two sets of data. You can't have one set of decision tree to say, do I report or don't you report anymore? You have to have two. And so I'm a little worried that some of the platforms that I've seen are a little bit narrow and are pushing off the diverging regulations, off to the future. And I think that they're going to come much quicker than anticipated. I'm not sure everybody's ready.
Fantastic, Linda. Thank you. Okay, we're going to now look at the poll results, if we may, and let's see what our audience think. Okay. So not surprisingly, let me read that out. So with less than 3 months to go until the end of the Brexit transition period, what are the outstanding challenges you faced in preparing for Brexit? Without surprise, we have a lack of detailed regulatory change at 65%, followed by working out how access to the UK market works at 29%, and then finally difficulty in terms of the changing reporting mechanism at 6%. It's not a surprise at all that there are no outstanding challenges gets a fantastic nil point. So I think it would be really good to get maybe two perspectives, given we have an esteemed panel, but we may just want to kind of maybe ask one or two people to comment. So maybe I can ask Ron, what are your perspectives in terms of, is there a surprise or anything that you're taking away from what our audience think to that question?
Yeah, so I think from how David and Adrian began the panel, so the answer there of lack of detail makes a lot of sense. But I think if I would be curious, one answer that wasn't there would be budget concerns. And I would be curious what have happened in that case, because I think that's also something that is a big challenge, that if people are realizing that there might be higher budgets than necessary, than they expected for handling this. Most to do with the lack of detail, that they couldn't plan for things, and suddenly there are these new issues that come up that they now have to account for.
Very, very good, Ron. Linda, anything to add to that from your perspectives?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Adrian may have been the one that mentioned it, right? You need to prepare for the worst. So from a technology perspective, right, you just have to get ready that things are, like I said, going to diverge as much as possible. So the lack of understanding that, of course, is giving everybody headaches. And so, I'm not surprised that was the front runner either.
Just one supplementary, if I may. Again, I think we're here talking about Brexit. It's the headline item. It's in the newspapers. But if you're if you're a mid to large size, it's one of many things, interestingly. And to Linda's point, I think people are starting to look strategically where they can. That Brexit and geopolitics, and maybe there is going to be fragmentation. So can we get a core data set that we can slice and dice for specific requirements, whatever they may be? That's certainly bubbled up. Like just very recently, we've seen foreign ownership rules, geopolitics. There's new rules around screening your portfolio composition. Sure. and ownership composition. You're seeing the US, China thing, and what, bans on certain holdings. That's probably the short to medium term future. So there's going to be lots of new regulation screening requirements driven by the political scenario. That's a challenge if you're on one side of the fence, and it's a huge opportunity if you're a provider of data services or regulatory reporting. So again, there's two sides to every challenge coin.
If I could add to that, Naresh, the other big elephant in the room, besides Brexit, which is coming up very fast, is all systemically important investment firms with assets in excess of 30 billion euros in Europe, whether they are indigenous or third country, will be subject to a new investment firm regulation from the 21st of June of next year. And that brings in with it a number of important implications. One, all of these firms are going to have to apply for a banking license. They will be treated as a bank. subject to CRD implications, liquidity, capital, transactional, and of course, derivative and trading disclosures as well. And also, they will find themselves being subject to the usual stress testing issues. And with that will come a range of questions from the ECB, who will be given the mandate to directly supervise this particular category of investment firms who trade, who clear, who invest. And that, for me, is the big elephant in the room. Brexit is important, but coming down the food chain very quickly behind this is this new piece of regulation covering all systemically important firms.
Thank you, David. And I do like the energy and enthusiasm on the panel with everyone kind of having a point of view. That's kind of fantastic. I'm going to move us on to the next question. And again, in the interest of time, brief answers, please, panelists. What are the practical considerations for financial institutions as they prepare for the reporting landscape post-Brexit? And how do we think that RegTech can play a part in improving efficiency, sustainability, etc.? So Linda, would you like to give us a view on that?
Sure. Of course, I always come with the data management perspective, but with respect to FIRDs and FIDRs, the FCA has aligned with ESMA's format, which makes onboarding the data less of a headache for many of us. However, the content will vary, with ESMA only supporting the EU, while the FCA is supporting the EU and UK securities. But there's no agreement on data equivalency. We keep using that word equivalency a lot around here today. So any solution will need to maintain both sets of data to some degree, and everybody's doing that a bit differently. But I think that RegTech, if it's a flexible enough system that you can really depend on providers to be able to take that complication away from you and provide that in an automated fashion. And then I think that the other thing is that over the next year, though, firms and service providers really need to pay attention to the dates and details that ESMA and the FCA are publishing. So if you depend on, either you have to have them inside, your organization or a combination of depending on a third party. ESMA, for instance, has been publishing their schedule with respect to post-Brexit transparency and liquidity data publications, SI volumes data publications. So the key is to be flexible, have a flexible data model and a robust operational procedures to ensure that each step, as large volumes of data is changing, that you flip from one originator to the other, that your systems are resilient enough to to consume that data and make it available to the right systems.
Fantastic. I'm just going to move us on to the next question, Lynn. So how do global firms manage this that need to meet, and I think it's come through from some of the actual audience as well. How do global firms really manage the need to meet both UK and EU regulations, especially for reporting, but beyond? Just brief answers if possible. Linda, yourself first.
Yeah, I think I spoke a lot about the impact of changing data sets, but what we really need to also focus on is the reporting decision tree, right? So globally, do you have the right solution in place that you can determine SI status under both regulations, right? Can you determine TOTV using different sets of data and under different regulations? So, what if the same instrument is classified differently in the EU FIRDs and the UK FIRDs, right? Does your system appropriately know what to do with that across jurisdictions? Is your exception management properly in place across both sets of data? So are you managing the data with the right operational staff to deal with all the exceptions? So I think from a global perspective, it's really about not just the divergence of the data, but the divergence of the decision tree for do I report, don't I report, and how do I report?
Fantastic. And David, very briefly, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think before we even get to the point of aligning the data reporting mechanisms between the UK and the EU, and let me just open a parenthesis there to say that the UK regulators have been very active in reaching MOUs with ESMA that Linda's just spoken about, but also with a number of other national competent authorities. So it's not as if we're starting from scratch. But for me, the biggest issue across Europe, and this has been underlined by ESMA, by the Commission, by the European Central Bank, is the lack of standardized identities for different transactional activities, whether it be trading or clearing, and the OTC space is a particularly good example of this. What we have at the moment is a very fragmented, heterogeneous system in Europe of data identification, which needs to be addressed. And indeed, in the first half of this year, ESMA issued at least 3 consultations in the context of MiFID and MiFIR, and also EMIR, in terms of the need to have a comprehensive standardization of data fields. And this was picked up actually recently also in the MiFID consultation by the Commission. So that's where I think the emphasis should be going forward. I think the sideline is the divergences between the UK and the rest of Europe. We need to, first of all, get our house in order in Europe first about data and the standardization of data before we move on to dealing with third countries.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Look, just before our final question, before we move on to some more great audience questions coming through that, so I don't want to leave those out. So our final question is, how can financial institutions sustain data quality as they move into the new regime? And I think Linda's already mentioned data quality as a key. And what will UK regulators expect in terms of data quality in reporting? So Ron, do you have any views on that?
So I think it goes back to what was one of the previous questions in terms of like what's the practical ways of handling Brexit and just changes in general. And one piece of advice that I like to tell people is, you have to go and grab information. No one's going to tell you when you have things wrong. You have to really figure it out for yourself. And a really good way of doing that is crowdsourcing. There's, if you're an institutional broker, there's 1,000 other companies that are exactly like you. Ask other people. If you have a question of what you're doing, ask other people. If you're in the sell, if you're in the buy side, AMA is a great, association. There's a few others, and they practical information. They're giving you, updates specifically what's going on to you, and you'll be able to meet other people with the same issues that you have. And I think just speaking to others and being part of that is a good way to kind of be able to get that, see where other people are having problems, and that might allude to an area that your data quality might have issues. And then just specifically to UK. I think they're the easiest. The FCA puts quite a few market watches out, and the market watches are basically telling you this is what we're looking at. These are the errors we're finding. And every investment firm in the UK should be looking at those market watches and see what if the FCA is looking at it, you probably want to be looking at it too.
Fantastic. Ron, I'm going to give you the final word since I got your name wrong at the very beginning of the.
Okay.
So you have the final word, but I think it's important to there are some great questions coming in through from the audience. So I'm just going to read a couple out and maybe just share amongst all of you for some perspectives, if that's okay. So this one's going to be an interesting one to answer. So on Linda's point of running 2 data sets and Ron's on budget, how much extra resource will we need to get past the end of the transition? Does anyone want to take that?
So I can, just in terms of budget, so 2 areas where people are not accounting for. When you do have dual reporting, it's not going to be necessarily a 2x type of fees that you're going to be paying for your arms and trade repositories, but there is an additional fees there, depending on how just the change of reports. So that's something that people should be taking into account too. And then another one, I think we're also seeing in terms of reverse solicitation. A lot of firms are expecting that in the future they'll be able to use different reverse solicitation in order to continue to support the existing clients, and that might be something that may work in the short term, but long term probably not. And then if you're not budgeting for a separate entity currently, then it's an area you probably want to be looking for.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question, again, quite specific. Looking at specific regulations such as SFTR, what will the impact be on investment bank if a bilateral equivalency decision isn't reached before the end of the Brexit transition period? I think David and Adrian both had points. Do either one of you want to take this question?
Yeah, well, on this specific piece of regulation, first of all, it's due to come into place, applied on the 10th of March next year, at least at level 1. We're still waiting for the crucial details, Naresh, which we don't have, which is the regulatory technical standards. And once we have those, we're going to be at best feeling around in the dark. I mean, I think even the regulators recognize that in the absence of these detailed regulatory technical standards, we are not going to know much more before the end of 2021. So I think, you know, both sides of the English Channel are probably facing the same degree of frustration in that they have to provide very high level, generic levels of disclosure in the absence of more detail.
Fantastic. So here's a question on MiFID II, and I can't believe it's 2000, although it's a bit closer than this. Does the panel expect the end of the transition to put as much pressure on firms and employees over the new year as MiFID II did in year 2000? I recall MiFID II in year 2000, although I forgot it was that long ago, in terms of the amount of pressure that was placed on firms to be able to comply. What does someone want to maybe take a view on that question?
I'll have a go and I'll say no. I think it's easy to talk about this as a doomsday scenario where nobody's done anything. I think the majority of firms have done something, be it on the dispersion or, again, the organizational side. I do think there will be uncertainty into and post year end, but I don't think it's the heavy lift that MiFID II was, the big bang approach. And the other thing is the FCA, more than ESMA's side, but they have, you know, they've frozen a number of regulations which stay in situ the same as it always was. There's the temporary permissions regime, there's the offshore funds regime. There's a number of contingencies on the UK side specifically that means that things will continue as they do now for a period of time. Over the medium to longer term, as we see divergence, we'll see big projects emerge. SFDR might be one, the UK version, the EU version, but I would be so bold to say that I don't think it will be as bad. And actually the Y2K one, I think, was referenced in the question. That was that was nothing in the end.
Indeed. So just one other question, and this is not a Brexit yes, a Brexit no question, but fundamentally it's about will the post-Brexit regulatory regime disadvantage financial services in the UK, and how can they address this? Who'd like to kind of have a quick?
Yeah, well, a very quick answer. Where we stand at the moment, the answer is yes, because in the absence of a EU equivalency determination decision, albeit I would endorse what Adrian said, is that we would probably end up with a couple of mini extensions, temporary extensions, to guide us over another transition period. But fundamentally, unless we get an equivalency regime that's acceptable to the EU and acceptable also to the United Kingdom, there are not every single permutation of financial services will be disadvantaged. For instance, deposit-taking banks, lending don't fall within this particular regime. Insurance, by and large, not either. But it's certainly issues like investment firms, MiFID, AIFMD, when it's fully upgraded and revised. But again, that's much further down the road. So right now, in the absence of at least a temporary extension to these equivalency arrangements, we could be heading for very substantial, I think, challenges. unless firms begin to negotiate with national competent authorities for access rights. Now,
fantastic. I think we're timed out, and this has been a fantastic panel of experts. So my thanks to David, Linda, Adrian, and Ron. And I'm going to hand us back to Andrew.
Yes, Andrew and Ron. Thank you, Naresh. Great session. Thanks to all our panelists. I was very happy to learn that we haven't got a Y2K type Christmas and New Year. So I'll tell the kids that it's not cancelled this year after all. So there's definitely some good news buried in that panel. Thanks all for your insights into that. Great. So let's move on. Next up is we're going to stay with Linda, who is going to deliver a keynote for us. But before that, we're going to hear a very brief, like an elevator pitch, startup elevator pitch from a company called Arcasio, who have a 1 minute video to showcase their offering. So let's sit and watch that for just 1 minute.
Arcasio is a new cloud compliance and archiving solution that keeps you in control of where your data is stored. With the effects of the Data Privacy Shield invalidation, the Cloud Act, and now also Brexit on the horizon, the current climate has left companies uncertain about whether storing their data internationally, most likely in the USA, is still a viable option. And that's where we come in. At Arcasio, we're not tied to one physical data center. Our archive is built using Google Cloud, meaning your data will only be stored in whichever geographical region you select. Arcasio offers a full suite of archiving services, including handling multiple channel types like email, chat, and social, with integrated compliance and discovery workflows. We offer regulator-approved worm storage and guarantee strong encryption at all times. All this and more can be accessed via our modern and intuitive web app. Get in touch or visit arcasio.com for more information.
Very good. Okay, so very timely ad there from Arcasio. You can meet with them. They are attending the event. So meet virtually, of course. You can set up a chat with Mike Salt from Arcasio. You can search him out using the networking function, and I'm sure he can fill you in on the details of their offering, which looked pretty apt given the last session. So anyway, that's Arcasio for you. Next up, I'm going to welcome back Linda Kaufman, EVP at SmartStream RDU, who's here to give us a keynote. Welcome back, Linda. I haven't seen you since just a few minutes ago and yesterday. Good to see you as always.
Good to see you, Andrew.
And you're going to be talking about leveraging regulatory specialists to add value and solve regulatory data challenges. Over to you, Linda.
Thanks, Andrew, for that warm welcome. Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here with you today. So it's a bit silly. My first slide, if you can move on to the first slide, it's a bit silly that I started with this slide. So reg tech growth. We all wouldn't be here today if this sector of the fintech world was not booming. The need is real, and there continues to be opportunity in this space to really influence cost, compliance, and technology initiatives. As you can see in the graph, the numbers, speak for themselves. Firms are hungry for reg tech solutions, and investment has just been pouring into this area, since 2015. And so whether it be driven by, reduction in cost, whether it be driven by, an appetite to reduce risk management, or just all the, fabulous technology that's coming out of the RegTech space, and firms wanting to have, quicker onboarding cycles and faster implementation cycles, all of these things are really driving the investment and the interest in the RegTech space. And then if you add to it, and the COVID factor, as I call it, which unless you've lived on another planet for the last few months, there's this little thing called a pandemic that we're all trying to manage. And we're really seeing that it's driving firms' desire to automate in the reg space. And it's really mainly driven by their worry, about the virus's impact on staff and manual processes. So I think it's just escalated the need and the desire for automation. So although all of this is true and the appetite is there definitely are many adoption issues that firms have when it comes to RegTech. So on the next slide, I just wanted to talk about a few of these challenges. So we have, your basic challenges that we all deal with all the time, right? Budget, resources, and prioritization. But I wanted to pick up the covers a little bit and look at some of the, challenges beyond those typical ones that we're dealing with when firms are trying to adopt RegTech. And so I wanted to start first with choices. And what can I say about choices? There's a ton of them. So we're really lucky to have really some great RegTech solutions available, and there doesn't seem to be a stop, right? It takes time to evaluate and find the right fit when you have so many choices to choose from. And it's a changing environment. But the effort, I think, is worth the time and energy. This is really a relatively young space, and there's a lot of innovative technology and a lot of solutions that are available. So the decision to build or buy is it's never an easy one. But if you are buying, deciding on what's best for your firm takes time. And so sometimes that's a hurdle that firms have to get over, given that there's usually such a strict regulation deadline that they're trying to adhere to. And I think also in regarding choices is the fact that we're really in an age where regulations are specialized, so solutions are specialized. So on top of there being choices that you have to kind of sort through, there's also the decision, am I going with a comprehensive choice or am I going with something that's more specialized? So once you make the choice, it's about how do I tie that into my architecture? And I don't have to remind anybody who's listening today about the headache of having to deal with integration with legacy systems, possibly multiple RegTech solutions, depending on what choice you make, as we just discussed. And taking the time to get the design right pays off at the end, but it is a hurdle that you have to get across. And so again, it's about managing that time. So taking the time to identify and choose the right solution for yourself, and then really building that architecture around it that will lead to a successful implementation. And once you get through all of that, or how you get through all of that, I should say, it's really dependent on, do you have the expertise in-house to deal with that? So the regulation, someone who understands and knows the regulations, yes, you need that. Somebody who understands the associated technologies, yes, you need that. But you also need people who understand that not only is the compliance and technology departments needed in this, big picture, but also the support teams. So it's wonderful if you have somebody in-house who's an expert who can help you make your choice, right, about how to go about your RegTech solution. It's great if you have the technology staff and expertise to deal with the architecture. Those are definitely needed. But you also need the expertise to deal with, how am I going to support this RegTech solution once it's up and running? And that leads us to data management. So in the data management space, it's really around resources. I think if you've listened to the last panel, we were talking about, Ron was talking about budgets. And so it's really around, okay, I've chosen my solution. I have the architecture and the design plan in place. I'm implementing it. I feel confident I have the expertise that I'm going to implement something successful. But now I'm up and running. How do I keep things going day to day? And so in recognizing that you're going to have exception management to deal with, you're going to have data quality issues. And resourcing that appropriately is really, really critical, and something that sometimes is forgotten. And so it's another hurdle and adoption, challenge that firms have. Can I get the budget not only to manage my RegTech solution, but also, put together a team to manage the day-to-day of that solution. And so on the next slide, so how can managed services and third-party providers help? And so my kids can't stand my analogies. I tend to use them all the time, so bear with me while I use one here. So in a way, I feel like RegTech is moving in the direction that doctors have over the last decade. So my parents had one doctor for everything back in the day. But as the medical industry advanced and there was just so much to learn in a given specialty, we needed a different approach. And as a result, most of us today see various specialists for our medical needs. We expect those specialists to know, all there is to know about the heart, the lungs, and so on. And I feel that we have a bit of the same setup in the RegTech space at the moment. We need specialists in order to understand the regulation, understand how to make our internal systems comply with the regulation, and then make sure that a specialist is on hand when things go wrong, which they do. However, due to this, the industry is seeing more collaborations. So as specialists bring their expertise together with other specialists to create a solution, or as discussed earlier, firms are having to manage the various specialists, just kind of like a primary care doctor does or a general contractor. It's an opportunity for collaboration that did not exist before. So I think basically firms are realizing two basic things. One is technology alone is not enough to solve a firm's regulatory challenges. You need the human touch. And that includes monitoring and understanding the regulation, data operations, so exception management and beyond. I can tell you that in the RDU experience, it's not the day-to-day operations tasks that you would typically expect a managed service to provide. We're being asked and pushed beyond that. You really need the expertise embedded in that operations service. And it's just not enough to pass through regulatory data, right? We need insight, guidance, and collaboration. And no two firms are alike. Their regulatory adoption and solutions are going to vary. So that's the second thing that I think is becoming more and more evident. And you can see it in the managed service and data provider solutions that are getting put forth. We recognize that there's legacy systems. So when somebody approaches a managed service or data provider in the RegTech space, we know we're not dealing with the same person. There's nuances at each and every firm. And so our services need to be flexible enough to deal with that. There's different interpretations of the regulation, which is very interesting to me. When I first started out in the regulatory data space, we understood the regulation and we assumed that everybody had the, relatively, maybe not exact, but relatively the same understanding of the regulation, and that's just not true. And so when you're trying to manage data sets or provide a solution to help determine reporting requirements, for instance, it's important for the service providers to understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, because not only are you dealing with the technology at the firms, but you also may be dealing with compliance offices that may just think a little differently about the regulation, and you have to be able to satisfy those requirements. And then, of course, the integration that I keep talking about over and over, right? We have, whether it be two RegTech companies that need to integrate, whether you need to integrate with multiple systems within an organization, there has to be that flexibility. We've, found APIs. You can see, if you look across the industry, APIs are really front and center. And I think that's one of the main drivers. So at the end of the day, I think it's really about a successful solution needs to have both the technology side and also the human side of things. And on the final slide, I just wanted to recap and touch on how providers are being asked to go beyond that day-to-day support. RDU, as well as other providers, are being asked to engage with the regulators. So, we're used to engaging with sources of data, but the regulators, it's a bit of a unique situation, right? So we've had a lot of, and we partner with other RegTech solutions that are very much engaged with the regulators, and the regulators are open to this mainly because, you know, data is at the heart of compliance, and the regulators also recognize this. And so there's an appetite on their side to have higher data quality, and thus communicating with the industry and being able to understand how the industry uses the data, which who's best to understand that from, but the RegTech solution providers. So we're finding that the engagement with the regulators is not only expected from our customers, but it's also something that the regulators are open to. Garbage in, garbage out is not acceptable, obviously, and providers are being leveraged to deliver the expertise needed to recognize the garbage and minimize impact to the clients. So I think in the beginning, data providers in the regulatory space, right, you get data from a regulator, you really think it's going to be a low touch process. And what we found is that, yes, it's low touch. You're not going to, you know, the regulator data is the golden source for that regulation. However, we have to protect our clients from the impact of that garbage. So there's a lot that's expected from the managed service and data providers, and that's why the expertise is needed so that we can, you know, manage any of the erroneous data that's coming out of the regulators to protect our clients. Provide solutions that are flexible in order to allow for different architectural approaches. I've gone over this enough in the previous slides, but very key and something that you know, the expertise is needed for. And then data sets provided in a way that allow the end users to use the data as they see appropriate based on their interpretation of the regulation. And I just spoke about that as well. I think it's something that you know, is a little shocking and shouldn't be, right? There should be a single interpretation. And again, in the previous panel, we talked about, you know, some great industry groups that gather and are good discussion point vehicles for understanding and getting a similar interpretation of the regulation. But there's always little nuances that make it a bit different from firm to firm. And we definitely saw that in the RDU space. Again, that's where my experience is, so I can share that with you. But in the MiFID space, we have, you know, I can think of two banks where they're using our same MiFID RegTech solution, but they've incorporated it into their what I call the reporting decision tree in different places. So because their interpretation is just a little different and their internal systems are just a little different, that they've chosen to you know, make certain decisions at different points. And so they use the technology in slightly different ways. And I think it's important to have the expertise to collaborate with the clients in order to identify the right place for that client to take advantage of the technology. And so I think just to kind of summarizing and tie things up, the keys are flexibility, counting on your specialists, making sure your service providers have those specialists, and to keep pushing the boundaries a bit, not just on the technology side, which is a really exciting area to be in, but also on the support side, to make sure that when you are when there is new technology and you're engaging with new technology, that there is a certain level of support that goes with it. It's the only way to make it successful is if you have both in tangent. So I want to thank everyone for joining me. And at this point, I will pass it back to Andrew.
Thank you, Linda, and thanks for that refreshing presentation. It's really good, I think, to bear in mind that sort of expertise side of the equation. We often talk about data, we often talk about technology, but it really is about bringing it all together, making it all fit, so that it actually does something useful
Exactly.
So that's what it's all about. I think it's easy to lose sight of that. We've had a bunch of Slido questions. I was going to ask you to the audience, that is, to submit more, but we're not even going to be able to get to all of these. So let me quickly just grab a couple of them that sort of follow on, I think, from some of the things that you were saying, Linda. One here is sort of goes on to that sort of expertise thread. As a financial institution, we would like to strengthen our regulatory expertise, but how can we do that when these skills are difficult to source? And then I'll combine that. You mentioned, and I think Ron brought it up in the last session, that there were some forums around that people could discuss, more granular topics around compliance. And I'm wondering, the question here is wondering whether there's any you've come across that could be a resource. So maybe those two questions combined in terms of where to find expertise.
Yeah, so I think, Ron was 100% on target with the fact that there are a number of organizations, right? Whether it's ISLA, there's a whole slew of them, right? That are trying to drive standardization across the industry, ISTA, et cetera. And other, depending on the regulation, there's different organizations, but we found that collaboration, so from a service provider perspective, we found that even our firms are willing to collaborate together, right? And so if you're using a third party, I would highly suggest that you talk to them about collaboration. And if there are other users of that technology that are willing to get together and talk about how they've implemented it, and what they're finding the challenges are, because it's very helpful in that degree. And I also think you need to look within your organization, because they're kind of hidden. So you may have somebody in your operations area who is dealing with this data on a day-to-day basis and has naturally had to organically become an expert. And so sometimes they're kind of hidden within your organizations, people that know the ins and outs of the regulation just because of their daily functions. So I think a combination of the industry groups that meet and collaborate together, as well as other users of your same technology, and then looking internally it's the trio.
Very good, and I think that addressed actually most of the gist of most of the questions that were coming in there. So fabulous answer, Linda, well done. And thanks again for your contribution, always very welcome. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise on this.
You're welcome. Thank you, Andrew.
See you again soon. Okay, so let's move on. Next up, we're going to have a practitioner perspective fireside chat. So the formats just keep changing, keep you engaged. This one is going to focus on the topic of ESG, everybody's favorite topic, certainly mine for the moment. It's with Beata Born of UBS Wealth Management. And for this session, I'm going to hand over moderating duties to my colleague, Lauren McCourtry. Lauren, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's great to have you here. I hope you've enjoyed the day so far. I'm Lauren McCourtry, editor at 18 Group, and I'm delighted to welcome Beata Born, the head of strategic projects, investment and trading platforms at UBS Wealth Management, who's joining me for our session where we're going to talk about the next frontier, the rise of ESG and sustainable investing. Beata, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Great. So we've seen a huge increase in ESG interest over the past few years. It's become one of the hottest investment trends in the world. Before we start, could you tell us just a little bit about yourself and about your particular interest in the area?
Yes, of course. So as you said, I'm the head strategic projects at Wealth Management in Zurich at UBS. I've been dealing with specifically regulatory implementation over the last sort of 15 years, be it MiFID, be it FATCA, be it EMIR, and so on. ESG is a topic, it's always been close to my heart. I'm also getting a master's at the University of Cambridge in sustainability leadership. And now these two pieces have actually merged, because now we're looking at a lot of regulatory requirements in the ESG space that are affecting the banks. and specifically in the data space. So that's how I come to the topic, and that's why I'm excited about it to a certain degree.
Great. Well, it's going to be a quick fire round today. We've got 15 minutes and we're going to whistle through some key questions where I'm really excited to hear your insights. And then hopefully we'll take a few minutes at the end and throw it open to the audience and let the audience ask you some questions as well. So if we kick straight off, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen a huge increase in ESG interest, but we've also seen some concerns come up around the kind of regulatory standardization elements. We've heard terms like greenwashing bandied about, concerns over funds, maybe not adhering to practices as rigorously as they should be. We're finally seeing regulation catching up with this, but where is this drive coming from? Is it coming from the regulators as a top-down approach, or are we seeing investors demanding better and more robust frameworks?
Yeah, look, I think, thanks for the question. It's a really good question. I think it's a combination of things, and we can only really understand it if we look at a little bit at the history of this whole ESG and specifically the climate movement, right? So we're seeing a general push from internationals like the UN, from the G20, organizations like the WEF, and that translates automatically into increased media coverage, political focus. And you've got companies coming out with statements around net zero plans and so on, right? So it's a big hype at the moment, and we also see a specific focus just on climate, and so that's just the E in the ESG. So the S and the G have moved a little bit to the background. The question is, where does that come from, right? So 3 decades ago, it was internationally recognized that we have an issue with global warming, and that started with the Kyoto Protocol in '97, moved on to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, where we adjusted those climate targets. And despite the fact that all 193, I think, nations agreed that they were going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, that actually hasn't happened. Right. Mm-hmm. So despite all of that push, we haven't reached that goal, and we do have an issue. So problem with climate change, not so much that it happens, but that it happens so fast, and our planet can't keep up. So it's a risk for our economies, obviously for our planet, but for our societies, and so it's all coming together into one now, right? So the combination of that and the fact that we're not reaching our goals leads then the regulator to step in, right? And what makes change happen faster? Money and regulation to a certain extent. So that's where the EU Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth comes in. And the idea here is literally to shift money into sustainable investments from the private sector. And by imposing regulations, you can, to a certain extent, you can do that. You can't do that by telling people what to invest in, but you can provide transparency and you can provide a better framework to make that happen. Mm-hmm. So the regulators did expect market self-regulation and self-policing to happen, but that wasn't actually the case. So now the EU regulator is actually the first one that's putting the hammer down and saying, okay, look, throughout all our regulations, integrated in prudential conduct and everything, we will have an ESG, specifically now climate focus.
Mm-hmm. So we've touched on this a little bit already, but maybe if we could drill down into that a bit deeper, what have been, from your perspective, the most significant regulatory developments in the ESG space over the past year? And again, what's coming up? What do firms need to bear in mind, that's important, that's going to be coming up on their radar for the future?
Yeah, look, I think on a macro level, there's three main things, right? So one is the spirit of the regulation that's shifted from sort of a financial materiality to a dual or dynamic materiality focus. So not just the effects that climate change has as a piece of risk management on the investment and on the organization, but also looking outwards. What's this investment doing to the planet? The other one is specifically moving assets into those positive investments, and then it's all about transparency and reporting, right? These are the main developments. Now, if we go into the actual regulations, as I mentioned earlier, there's 3 different types, right? Those that are already in effect that have been amended to include now ESG topics. So on the conduct and the prudential side, so we've got, for example, MiFID II has been amended, AIFMD, IDD, UCITS on the conduct side, and also regulations like CRD and CRR2 have now pulled those ESG pieces into the actual regulatory text in terms of amendments. Now, one of the most significant development, I would say, is circling, that everything is circling around data. Everything is circling around transparency, similar to what we've seen with the OTC regulations, but now specifically on ESG information and around the definition of what is sustainable. So if we pick a couple out, for example, we've got the NFRD, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. That's in review at the moment, but it's already in effect. It essentially is a reporting standard for larger organizations, so that applies to everyone. Then there's the Sustainability Disclosure Regulations, so the SDR, and that's only for financial services institutions, and that essentially forces these financial service institutions to show the RSI risks and adverse impacts of the investment. So that's where we see the dual materiality already. And then the most important one to me is the taxonomy, because I think people haven't woken up to the fact that this piece of regulation, so one, the taxonomy regulation, and then the taxonomy itself, will really change the way we work with ESG data. This one defines exactly what a sustainable activity is in which industry and the specific metrics for that, which is completely different from any other standard that's out there at the moment, including the NFRD.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's really interesting, and we've discussed this sort of so far, perhaps from the regulatory perspective, from the regulatory angle, what's happening with regulation. Maybe if we can flip that round a little bit now and look at it from the perspective of these firms that are going to have to comply with this. What are those key data and reporting challenges around ESG that they're going to be facing now that regulatory landscape is changing? And crucially, what solutions are out there that are going to help them comply with that?
Yeah, there again, I see 3 or 4 main topics, right? So we've got one of the biggest one is the sheer volume of data that's out there, right? So that pile of data that could be reported, but nobody really knows what exactly has to be reported, right? The second problem is that there's so many ways of reporting it. There are tons of voluntary standards out there. I mean, the TCFD is probably not the most prominent one. You've got the SASB, the GRI. Those are not mandatory, but they're almost generally accepted, right? So there's the industry banks on this quite a bit. And then ironically, amongst all these massive mountains of data, you also have the data gaps. Because it's not mandatory, not everybody reports in the same way. So you've got, especially the smaller firms, they don't have the capacity to put out all these different reporting. So you've got gaps, depending on what you look at, you've got gaps in your data set, which is another challenge we need to overcome, right? Mm-hmm. And then one thing I would like to pick out as well is the fact that the regulation doesn't necessarily match up with the voluntary standards. And the voluntary standards are quite powerful because the industry or the economy in general works by it, right? I mean, everybody knows what GRI is, everybody knows what TCFD is, what most people know what CDP is, and so on. So those have actually come together and aligned to a certain degree, but still there are quite some discrepancies, right? Mm-hmm. And especially the question of materiality. That's a big one as well. How do you report? Do you report from your own risk perspective, or do you report from the planet's perspective, or do you report dynamically? And the regulator asks you to report dynamically, whereas most of the standards, SASB and GRI are on the opposite ends of the spectrum, but most of the standards are mostly on the financial side. Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay, so on a practical level, and we're just going to go to this one final question before I open up and take some questions from the audience. But on a practical level, what should, in your opinion, risk managers be doing to integrate these ESG frameworks into their current risk management practices? What do they need to watch out for? What challenges are there going to be in compliance? What on a practical basis, what should they be doing to take these steps forward?
Yeah, so look, I think the key is focus and simplification, right? So the first thing to do is to figure out what's relevant for you. So which are your stakeholders that you need to please? So one thing, obviously, if you want to stay in business, you need to have regulatory compliance. Right? And then you got to pick out the products where that's easiest. If you've got products where it's hard to do, you can't get the data, we'll figure out if you've got the revenue base to support that activity. And the other end of the spectrum is, you've got players like the stock markets, for example. If you want to be listed on a stock exchange, what reporting requirements do they have, right? And make sure you comply with those. Then which of these standards are biggest and most important in your geography, right? So the states are completely different from Europe, for example, right? And again, set the focus and also pick some that will also satisfy other requirements, right? So if we take the big five now, they have come together and said, okay, we're going to have to align this somehow. We're going to have to come up with the same type of standards so that a company only reports once, right? So those are the sort of things to look out for. And one last thing I'd like to mention here as well is the corporate purpose. We hear a lot about integrated reporting, and we hear a lot about shareholder value and short-termism versus long-termism, and they all seem to be buzzwords, right? But in the end, I think we've come to the point where your strategy and your corporate purpose have to exactly mirror what you put out in corporate reporting. Because if that doesn't match up, that's a recipe for disaster, and it's a recipe for disaster for a risk manager, because then you use all credibility in the market and you've got a massive reputational risk. Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So one final question to wrap up before we've got a whole bunch of questions from the audience of people who clearly want to tap into your expertise. So I'm going to move on to those in a second. But just to finish up with, what should firms be thinking about as a matter of urgency for 2021? What's coming up that they really don't want to miss, that's going to trip them up if they're not focusing on it? And what should they be doing right now to prepare for that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of consultations out for SASB, for example, they've got a consultation out. So those things are something to watch out for if you're big enough to voice an opinion, or even if you just want to voice an opinion. And then obviously have all the regulations and the go live dates under control, right? So we've got the amendment of the NFRD that's coming next year. The SDR is going live in March 21. We've got the benchmark disclosure obligations in December 21. The taxonomy is now in the implementation period, will go live also December 21. Let me think. Eco-label for financial products is not clear yet, but that's in the making as well. And of course, the MiFID amendments. So the MiFID amendments to the template, that's coming up quite quickly. So those are the pieces I think specifically somebody in the firm should look into to figure out, okay, can we somehow manage to cover those by the time this requirement comes into place?
So there's clearly a lot of work to do, and really recognize this because we're getting lots of questions through. So we're going to take 5 or 10 minutes just to run through these. And the first one that we received is, and I'm just going to read this out to you directly: how can financial firms express their commitment to ESG and sustainability in a market that is exploding but has very few common measures and standards?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, right? It's exactly what I've just been talking about, and I'm going to have to go back to my point of align your purpose with your reporting. So it doesn't, if you have, and we see this at UBS, right? I mean, I think everybody's struggling with it to a certain degree. You've got sort of your sales division, and you want to advise, and that's part of MiFID. You need to advise the client on sustainable investments, right? That needs to line up with your research division that comes up with the ratings for sustainable investment. Can you actually ensure that what you're offering in your discretionary portfolio that you say is 100% sustainable is actually sustainable, and what are the metrics you're using, right? Then obviously you can always do things like commit to a net zero by 20x, right? 2030, 2050. Again, need to make sure that actually is auditable. Right. So how do you show your commitment? One is provide transparency to the client. So become a leader in, sustainable investments, the offering of the products. Right. That's one thing. The other thing is obviously look at your own investments. Make sure you can always say things like, we have. We're not investing in mining anymore at all. We've taken it out. Right. That sort of thing. So those statements. Always show commitment, but there always needs to be a follow-up. And I think what we've seen a lot is just boilerplate statements with not much behind. And the industry is going to start appreciating depth rather than just publicity. I think we've moved out of the activism Greta Thunberg phase into the action phase, right? If that makes any sense. I hope that answered the question.
It's time to start putting your money where your mouth is rather than just putting lip service to it. Okay, so I think we've got probably time for 2 more questions. So this is, I guess, looking more at the nuts and bolts of fund management, but how are fund managers managing the problems around gaps in data disclosure from the corporates in their portfolio when they need to meet these upcoming sustainability disclosure requirements?
Yeah, look, they're all managing it, and the way they do it is they come up with their own methodologies, right? So I mean, most fund managers would get data from Sustainalytics, MSCI, Truecost, wherever, and you know, we do it as well. We've got we have, I think, 4 or 5 different data providers, and we run our own methodology over it, and we come up with very good ratings, right? And that's how they do it, and that's how they can also prove that they've done their due diligence, which at this point is enough. So the SDR doesn't require you to do any more. But in the next step, everybody, so today, let's say UBS and Credit Suisse come to a different conclusion regarding the Tesla share, right? Depending on which way you look at it. In the future, that cannot happen anymore, right? So today, I think everybody is, you know, sending out questionnaires, gathering information where they can, coming to a conclusion that they can then argue, and that's fine for now. And I'm not saying anybody's doing anything wrong or necessarily everybody's greenwashing, but soon that will obviously change, right?
So we're looking towards convergence, and on a completely opposite topic of divergence, the final question that I'm going to give you. An earlier panel today talked about Brexit. Obviously, this is a really hot topic right now, especially in the UK. How do you expect the UK and Europe to move forward on ESG regulation after the Brexit transition period ends?
Yeah, okay, it's a good question. I'm actually running the Brexit project for UBS as well. So look, I mean, in terms of, I think financial services is the least of their worries at the moment. I think they're more concerned with you know, the actual, you know, tangible economy, and the rule at the moment is everything stays as is. So technically, the UK is still a MiFID country from the UK perspective, for example, right? So I'm expecting there to be close alignment, right? I'm expecting the UK to adopt, at least for now, that everything is in flux, to not just upset the system any further. I'm expecting them to do the exact same as the EU. Obviously, the EU doesn't see the UK as an EU country. It's now a third country, but that's a different view, and it wouldn't change necessarily, you know, the way that the UK would rate financial products. So I think there, at least, we will have a little bit of smooth sailing in that sense. But that's just my personal opinion. I'm not an expert on specifically UK and ESG. But yeah, that will be my assessment.
And I have one final question for you before we close up, and it's a big one. Who do you think will be the winners and losers in ESG, and why?
Oh wow! I wish I could have prepared for that one. Look, I think ESG has actually been a bit of a cash cow for some industries, and I think data is definitely one industry that where we've seen a lot of activity. And while there have been some winners, there will be some losers, and especially when this comes to the point where, you know, having the data is not your differentiating factor anymore. And I think in terms of, you know, what to do in this case, and one thing we always need to think about when we're implementing regulations and implementing data management is, do you want to buy or do you want to sell? Right? Or sorry, buy or develop yourself. If you want to develop it yourself, make sure you can sell it. So it's sort of the focus on your well, your strengths, right? I mean, it might make sense if you're a smaller player to just buy this information and not have your massive methodology run over it and have, you know, 15 analysts sitting there and going, you know, now we need to analyze this stock and this stock and this stock. Maybe just buy that and just say, okay, this is sustainable and this is not. This is taxonomy aligned, and we're good. But again, if that's your speciality, then you focus on it. And I think that's where we will see consolidation in the market. And obviously, the losers will be those that are currently greenwashing, right? Mm-hmm. So that will be unforgivable in the future. So those that have so BP, for example, right? It's a perfect example. I mean, you could speculate that they're going to go under because they've committed so much, and it's really, it would put a massive strain on the organization to push this through. But at the same time, all of the peers will have to go down the same route. And once, if they survive this, then they'll be at the forefront. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's like that with every industry in this space. Mm-hmm. If you get on the bandwagon early, then you'll be a winner. Otherwise, yeah,
great.
You'll be left behind.
The conclusion is focus on your strengths, but make sure you follow through, because you won't be able to get away with it otherwise.
Pretty much, like always in life, right?
Well, Beata, thank you so much for what was really an amazing and incredibly insightful session. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to hand back to Andrew Delaney now to continue with the next session. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you both. And actually, I wish there was another session, but unfortunately that we're going to wrap up for today. I have to say that was a very exciting session. Interesting, you brought up the example of BP, because for me, the light bulb went off in my head when I heard the former chairman of BP, Lord Brown, on BBC Radio discussing how it would be activist investors that changed the culture of BP rather than any indeed any regulation, as you say. It's more about the sort of the voluntary activities of the industry that change the mechanics and the dynamics around future direction. And it's a very interesting twist on it to me, that indeed they could come out as the industry leaders if everyone else has to follow suit. There you go.
Absolutely.
So yep. ESG, very hot topic. Thank you very much. Brilliantly done. Great session.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us and sharing your expertise. Just everybody, thanks for joining us today. It has gone very quickly for me. I didn't have to do much today, which is always quite nice. So I got to enjoy the sessions a bit more. Let us know what you think as we're sort of developing our strategy around these virtual events. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think about these shorter hits every day. They go fast, but the idea is that we can get a lot of content to you and yet leave you to do your day jobs at the same time, because we all have those to do, don't we? So anyway, yeah, do let us know. We'd love to hear from you. So back to where we're at. Tomorrow we start again at 3 p.m. GMT, 10 a.m. EST. Another installment. The theme for tomorrow is global regulatory priorities and best practices for regulatory reporting efficiencies. I know there's a couple of heavyweight sessions going on because I'm going to be moderating them. So I'm going to get an early night tonight, so you won't see me at Harry's. I'll see you all tomorrow, same time, same place. Thank you. Bye-bye.